All right, Brian, I think we are live, sir.
All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for being here today. My name is Brian Zawada, and I'll be working here with Chris Hurst to talk a little bit about threat intelligence today. But before we get into that and do some introductions, just a little bit from a logistics perspective, we absolutely encourage engagement throughout the course of our session here today. There is a chat capability, so please put your questions in, your comments, anything else that you'd like to tell, and Chris will certainly be monitoring that while I'm driving the presentation. And also there will be a recorded version of this presentation that will be on the DRI website shortly. So again, just by way of background introductions, my name is Brian Zawada. I'm the Vice President of Strategy for Risk Connect, and with a focus on our business continuity and resilience areas. I've been in this space for over 25 years now, and I'll talk a little bit about some of my early backgrounds and why this topic is really interesting to me, and but we'll get there in a little bit. But Chris, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Also, I've had about 2 decades of risk management. I started my career after graduating from West Point as an Army diver, thought a lot about risk and I'm in an operational context. Later worked in Iraq and Afghanistan as a civilian, building infrastructure, and needed faster access to good security data. Is this place safe? Is it not safe? What's happening on the ground? Do we take civilians there? Do we not? Later, I was a director of enterprise risk management at Mercy Corps, a large NGO, and we had a very large water improvement project in the Congo that was stopped in its tracks because militia activity broke out. And turns out it had been in the news and social media before we did the project, and we had to stop the project and did a big AAR and realized there needed to be a change. So that goes all the way back to 2012, and then from there started a risk intelligence company that is now part of OnSolve. So great to be here today.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I won't make any comments about West Point when I do the rest of my introduction here in just a moment. But we're going to go ahead and introduce our 2 organizations that we're coming from. So first off, I'll introduce Risk Connect. We're a software and services firm that focuses on integrated risk management. And that really means we're covering the entire gamut of all things risk management. And that gets into everything from GRC, business continuity, environmental, social governance, or ESG, all the way into the insurable areas as well. And so we have about 2,000 customers spanning the entire globe. I joined Risk Connect in July of last year when my firm Castellan was acquired by Risk Connect, and I source all the way back to being a founder of Evolution. So it's great to come together for an organization that covers all facets of this specific area. And Chris, do you want to go ahead and introduce OnSolve?
Thanks so much. So OnSolve really started in the wake of 9/11, the September 11th attacks. We started as a critical comms solution, a series of solutions. Sendward Now, Mir3, those were some of our larger brands. Over the years, we grew and added the company that I co-founded to provide our risk intelligence and travel solutions. So you can see some of the stats there. About 2 billion alerts and messages sent annually. About 100,000 events detected every week, and a whole lot of PNRs, passenger name records, just to give you a sense of the scale. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So in terms of our webinar objectives today, number one, we were asked to talk a little bit about a hot topic, and we're seeing this in the market as well, but DRI was too, and that was around the idea of threat and risk intelligence. We're going to use those terms potentially interchangeably today. And we want to talk a little about what is it. We're going to talk about the use cases as it relates to business continuity and resilience. Chris is going to talk quite a bit about the value proposition and why it's more important than ever. And then I'm going to end the session today with what I'm seeing is the 5 most common or successful steps to getting started on the threat intelligence journey. So our background, our agenda, we'll give a little bit of background, to really set the stage, put up the boundaries for this, and again, talk use cases. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the marketplace and how threat and risk intelligence is being used both proactively and reactively. And again, all the enablers and the 5 steps that go into it. And again, please put your questions in there. We'll be interacting with you throughout the course, or save your questions at the end and we'll address them there too. So when I thought a little bit about this specific webinar, I went back to my Air Force days. And so number one, when I was at the Air Force Academy, I got the opportunity to work at the Pentagon for 2 years and got a chance to, and I was an intelligence officer, and I got a chance to work there and had some incredible experiences briefing people like Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, and and other decision makers at the Pentagon from an intelligence perspective. And then after I graduated, after spending a little bit more time in school, I also went and started off a surveillance platform called JSTARS, which is a picture of which is on the right. And when I thought about, when I left the Air Force years later and I joined the private sector, it was interesting to see the parallels to what we do in the business continuity and resilience space, but even more so when it comes to threat and risk intelligence. Because when I put air quotes around intelligence in the private sector, to me, it was really 4 specific things. Number one, it was a means of informing decision makers to help kind of steer them or give them the information they needed to make decisions, of course. A big part of it was to be able to take a look at different indicators and predict the actions of different adversaries around the world. I put in quotes proactively affect change because I think one of the things that is important from an intelligence perspective is you're directing military arms against specific targets to affect change, to protect interests. And I think the 4th one, which really appealed to me, especially in the latter part of my career in the Air Force, was really keeping the team safe. In other words, that airplane that I showed on that previous slide, keeping it from being shot down. And so when I think about threat and risk intelligence, this is a big part of the intelligence world in the private sector organization. Hopefully being able to proactively affect change, but also be able to react in a much more timely manner. And that's why this topic really does appeal to me rather significantly. Now, but before we get into it and before we kind of dive into defining this in the private sector, Chris, why don't you go ahead and share a little bit of background, if you wouldn't mind?
Yeah, so let's start with some stats, and I'm going to go all the way back to 2001 when after my career kicked off as an Army officer. I used a probability severity matrix. We're not showing it on the slide here, but I'm sure everybody's seen it before. Probability on the left-hand side, severity across the top. And what it taught us to do was focus on the most likely events that were going to be the most severe. So the biggest events that also were most likely. And the sense was you could ignore the unlikely because they were random and rare. For those of you who've been in emergency management, there's a whole framework built on random and rare, right? But if you look at the charts on the left-hand side, you see the number of United States billion-dollar disaster events from 1980 to today, and that's obviously adjusted for inflation. What you see is those events are generally about the same, a few events every year. And then something big started happening in 2004. And I'm going to say what it is. If anyone can remember with a big event in 2004, and I'll give you, there's another one in 2005 that kicked off what I think became a new trend of increasing frequency. So as you see in 2004, 2005, more and more big events started happening. So to those of you who feel like, man, it feels like things are changing and getting a little bit worse in some ways. I haven't had a blue sky day in a long time. It's been a while. You're right. The data reflects that. I see someone comes in and says hurricanes. Hurricane, yes. Katrina in 2005 was the big event that shaped started kicking off this trend to up, and then the Indonesian tsunami in 2004. And what you see is even on the right-hand side, the number of events this year is also leading recent years. So we see more in recent years, and we see this year is being higher. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see is that this isn't just true for weather. Yes, it is true for extreme weather, but it's not just about weather. When we started measuring data in our system for events that affected our customers, and that's an important caveat. We have about 30,000, and so we were really looking at what are the big events and trends that are affecting our customers. We saw significant events in extreme weather. Hurricane Ian was the 3rd largest natural disaster since we've really been measuring this since 1980, and that happened right after we released a report last year. We see the rise of transportation incidents. I'm going to mention the Palestine, Ohio train derailment, all the way down to, disruptions related to I-70 closure and car disruptions. On the power side, on the infrastructure side, usually if you think infrastructure in our space, you're thinking like, okay, so it's probably correlated to the Texas freeze or maybe blackouts, which are becoming more of a risk. But we also started seeing last year some of the rise of man-made power failures, and you can think about the intentional attacks in North Carolina and Washington state. And so what are the impacts of this? We're going to come back more to this at the end, but I would encourage everyone to think about not only the impacts to health and safety and protection of people, but also the business impacts. This is being able to frame your role in terms of the business value, I think is really helpful. So take those top incidents and then look at what's the unplanned operational downtime. If you've got a large company of large manufacturing sites, that's going to end up being millions of dollars. Same thing for brand reputation, product shrinkage or loss, investor confidence, employee confidence. So we're seeing a rise in incidents. In our data, I would suggest that 90 to 95% or more of you are also seeing a rise of incidents. And also those events are having a direct impact on business value. Let's go to the next slide. Part of our, you see here at the bottom, the global risk impact reports. When we measure this data, we release it to clients and to the public. You can find that on the Unsolve website. We also, as part of that last year, interviewed more than 300 CEOs, and we asked them, what are your top priorities? And if you look at the chart, on the left-hand side, you'll see the remote work, the hybrid workplace is the largest concern, but right behind that was preparing for a physical event, and then behind that was supply chain disruption. We found that really interesting and notable that those two were larger than concerns about recession and inflation, which are clearly, if you've watched the market, clearly big concerns over the last couple of years. We also saw that 60% of CEOs have no plans to address the most severe physical threats to their business, which means it's incumbent upon us as business continuity and security leaders to help frame the rising risk back in terms of value, to give them an ROI for that, which again we'll come back to. So that's kind of setting the stage of the context over the last broadly 20 years.
All right, well, thanks, Chris. And so, as promised, we wanted to talk a little bit about what threat and risk intelligence means to organizations today. And so these were just a couple thoughts that I had. I'm going to invite Chris to react to these here as well. And number one, I think it's a little bit of trend analysis in many ways. It's situational awareness regarding what's happened in the past and where are we potentially at risk. What should we be thinking about? Not that that everything in the past will happen in the future, of course, but it does give you some indicators. And there are certain things, obviously, from a natural disaster perspective, that certainly the past is a good prediction. So that's situational awareness to inform strategy, number one. Number two, it's around advance notice or a timely notification of something that is about to happen or just did happen. And so we all know that the faster, the better we're able to communicate and respond to various forms of events, the decreased impact that occurs. And certainly we preserve a number of different things in terms of financial reputation, et cetera. So that's certainly important. And I think when we have built an appropriate process or really a program that involves or the connections between business continuity and risk intelligence, we are now seeing where can we potentially trigger certain strategies or plans that we've spent a lot of time developing, trigger those into motion again to be able to do so as quickly as possible. But another big part of this, and it really comes down to the fact that I think we can all acknowledge that there is so much information out there. Many different information sources, both traditional media, social media, different service providers, et cetera, that really can provide a huge amount of information that also can be noise. And I think the idea of finding ways to be able to consume that information, automate, filter, direct that information is huge. Anything you want to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, I'm gonna address two things. One is Pratik in the chat was asking about cyber threats, and I just wanted to acknowledge absolutely. And by the way, the fact that we did not list things like the rise in active shooters or the rise in cyber or the rise of retail theft or the nature of retail theft, for those of you, we are seeing significant changes in many areas. And I'm actually curious if anyone wants to write in the chat what their context is. We'll circle back on that. So thanks for that comment, Pratik. In terms of the question here, what is threat or risk intelligence? I'm going to take you back to 2012 when I was a director of risk management. I used a framework that looked at strategy risk. So that is, what are the risks to our strategy? That's like, where are we trying to go? Are we trying to double revenue? And so there's a risk framework there. I looked at internal risks. So those are risks that arise from within the organization. And Brian, at the beginning, you talked about GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And clearly, the risk model there is you got to shut it all down. You can't have a little bit of fraud, a little bit of employee violence, a little bit that comes from within the organization. So you think about culture, you think about hiring practices, processes, right? Then when I think situational awareness, I thought about external risks. So this is the organization's moving through the operational environment, and things are happening to us. What's fascinating is that in 2012, in that role, the best practices were in basically, since you can't control how many disasters hit you, or the scale of the fire, or because it's outside of your organization, or you can't control it. The model was build exercises around that, workshop it, think about it, and clearly those are important. But what's become really powerful over the last 10 or 11 years since we co-founded the solution is it is now possible to know faster about those events. Whereas 2012, the systems, the technology, the informational environment made that really complex.
No, great.
And so yeah, so that's my comments on situational awareness there.
No, that's great. And then when we start getting into some of the use cases, if you will, number one, again, I'm not advocating threat-based planning. That's always, that's a common question or a common observation, even objection at times. But the idea of being able to really be able to know yourself, and then what are the things that could potentially impact, your key dependencies. And so when we talk about informing decision-making, similar in many ways to my Air Force experience, looking at different trends that have happened over time. Where are we seeing increases in threat occurrence? Where are we seeing different impacts on different dependencies and the like? So that trending part is huge. Where we're positioning resources, where are we locating certain factories? Where are we locating call centers? Those type of things. And then based on trending, based on what's, where things are occurring, where do we want to invest limited resources from a mitigation perspective? So that's a big one. And again, we all understand that business continuity, resilience isn't just a reactive discipline. It's equally about proactive, if not more important, because we want to be able to prevent disruption from happening in the first place. But the other is, of course, the reactive element. And that is that, there's a lot going on. We're involved in so many different areas as risk professionals. And so being able to have automation to be able to go ahead and identify, when I need to trigger a response, when I need to trigger that strategy or plan to be able to minimize impact, that's huge as well. So again, it's a tool in the toolbox, so to speak, in terms of being able to go ahead and minimize impact. So dynamic risk is something we hear a lot about. Chris, do you want to go ahead and explain that to everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. So this really started kind of mid-COVID for us, where we started hearing business continuity, security practitioners, other risk managers say, man, I feel like I'm getting hit with multiple events. I feel like my staff is exhausted. I feel, when we started breaking down, like, well, say more about the events that you're getting hit with. It was, well, I thought that the Hurricane Ida was going to hit the Gulf Coast. We were ready for that. But does anyone remember what Hurricane Ida actually caused? It was flooding in New York. Mm-hmm. And so what we see is that the risks were changing. So risk A becomes risk B. We saw that risk were enabling other risks. So I lived in Santa Monica during the George Floyd protest, and actually ended up evacuating my family as relatively peaceful protest enabled looting. The 3rd Street Promenade was completely destroyed for those of you who know that area. So you have risk enabling other risk. You have risk causing other risks. So we saw one of our large clients in South Atlanta, a tornado came along and ripped up a community. The tornado was the initial risk, but then power lines were and gas mains were broken. Those caused evacuations, and then schools were shut down. And so if you think about the dynamic nature of risk A causing risk B, causing risk, and then ultimately schools shut down, people aren't coming to work. And that's all about the risk itself, much less the impact and the cascading impact to our organizations. We're still global. I think we could go in a longer conversation on how COVID may have and supply chain disruptions in China may have affected your organization. But organizations are still global, and the more surface area points you have in that dynamic environment, where there's more frequency, where there's more severity, means that you're going to get hit more frequently and have more cascading events within your own organization as well.
Great, thanks, Chris. So continuing on, kind of like, what is it? Number one, I think it's important to recognize that, and by the way, this goes back to the comment that was in the chat before about, cyber and other types of threats, risks, events. The idea of being able to have content that you can correlate to, where do you have a physical presence, whether that be your headquarters, specific sites, a person, maybe it's even a pathway, meaning between you and a supplier. That's huge. Content that may be applied to one of your subsidiaries, an entity of sort, or maybe even a supplier itself. So news about that supplier, for example, and that might even include financial related information. It could be related to an asset that's in the news, and that's raw materials. It could be an application, a technology that's important, again, correlated to what you're using. Could be about an event, and the latest event about a hurricane, a cyber attack, you name it. And then there's also things like, intelligence around conversations that are taking place. And I think one of the classic examples that comes to mind here is what took place earlier in the year around Silicon Valley Bank, where you had a run on a bank that was heavily fueled by a conversation that was taking place online, that just continued to spiral without a whole lot of engagement really from the organization, at least in those channels. And so being able to monitor many different sources correlated to many different elements of the business is really, really important. And I think one of the things that I like to spend a lot of time talking about with organizations is that, if we talk about coming out of COVID or some of these other major events that have taken place in recent years, we're finding that fewer and fewer people are really spending huge amounts of time documenting and creating plans. But what they are spending a lot of time in is using tools like BIA and other ways to get to know themselves, and what I call building the digital model of the organization. And that is being able to have kind of that source of information all about you in terms of, where you're located, where are your people, who and where are your suppliers, what are the technologies that you're employing, the threats, of course, applied to that, as well as events. And so being able to have something that you can query and say, you know what, I lost X because of Y. What are the cascading impacts down the line, that dynamic risk in many ways that Chris was talking about? And so being able to understand, hey, what, this has been impacted. What strategies, alternatives, substitutions do I have? And that's where you can really query that information. If you've done a good job building it and maintaining it, it could be a differentiator in your overall response. And then when combined with threat intelligence, that's where I think really the magic happens. And so from the perspective, and I know I mentioned this already, and I'm going to invite Chris to talk a little bit about this too. When we talk about sources, just to kind of cover the basics, there's the traditional media. There's news, whether it's, online, print, TV, radio, you name it. There's the social media channels that are ever exploding. That which is sponsored by government, like NOAA and other sources that provide information. And of course, service providers as well, that make it their role to be able to consume this information, filter it, and provide it to their partners. But Chris, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, let me just start with the concept, and then I'm going to tailor the concept to your a listener's use case. So the concept is that when anything bad happens, you can think storm strike, protests, disaster, shooting, planned protest, planned riot, right? That event, happens in the real world. But in order for us as practitioners to know about that, we need a source to talk about that. And then, so that's what you see on the slide, right? Each of these sources have strengths and weaknesses. So sometimes the news can really be very slow. Sometimes they can report on events from, yesterday or even years ago. Sometimes social media can be fast, not always. Sometimes it can be fast. Sometimes it can be incomplete. Sometimes government feeds, like it could include a computer-aided dispatch, can be police arriving on scene, right? Sometimes service providers will focus on a theme, like disruptions related to travel or geopolitical disruptions. Different service providers have different kind of focus areas. One of the recommendations I would have is that you don't rely on a single method because of those strengths or weaknesses. In other words, you want to layer those in. So layer multiple sources of news, because one is going to be faster than the other. You want to layer in social media because they typically are faster. But then you need to do some things like if there's a lot of bots and trolls, and we predict that the bots and troll problem is going to get only worse with the rise of large language models and foreign state actors like China and Russia and so on. And so there's some things that you need your vendor, your risk team like us to do to filter those out. And so we take all of these very seriously in our R&D cycles and our product cycles. We have a data operation team that goes and looks at, is this a valid source? Do they say true things? And if multiple people are talking about that, how do we ensure we don't send 1,000 alerts, right? We need to, deconflict and deduplicate. So there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. Hopefully to the end user, that's all seamless. But if you're thinking about a solution, those are some considerations to think about. The last thing I'll say is, the end recipient is important to think about. So, for example, we had a call where a client said, "Look, I've got a data center in Spain. The data center manager speaks mostly Spanish. That is not a good use case for sending kind of raw tweets right to that data center point. There needs to be a little bit of filtering and polish on that. But if you got a large GSOC, if you've got like a team of people who are like, look, I need to know absolutely as fast as possible, speed is paramount, then you're going to want to push more kind of raw information that hasn't been fully vetted to them, particularly as long as the source is vetted, as long as they say true things in the past, and then allow them to engage in some of that process." I see, let me just see here. Arlen asked the question, could you elaborate on your use of the term service provider? I'll take that. And then also, let me just say, Denise, I see there's an awesome question here about leveraging AI. I think we're going to hit that at the end. But if you have to go, ping us and we'll try to get to it faster. So one way to think about the service providers, you've got your organization. You've got you, Arlen, this is for you, in the role of business continuity or security or other risk management role. And then you've got a team of people that can come to help you. You've got, Risk Connect, you've got OnSolve, you've got analyst firms, and there's an ecosystem of, sometimes analysts who are in that process of receiving and processing that information. Hopefully that makes sense. And Brian, I'll go back to you, sir.
All right. Well, that sounds good. Yeah. And when I think of, we talk about some of the many challenges out there, I guess one of the things I'll ask you, Chris, maybe once you kick this off, and I'm going to provide some commentary after.
Okay, no, that sounds good. So the goal for risk intelligence is to be as fast as possible. Coverage means not missing it. And so what does speed mean? Speed means being able to have the information fast enough so that you can respond to it and provide value, protect people, limit harm, right? Coverage means that when a storm strike process disaster happens anywhere in the world, let's say the Philippines, but you're headquartered in Florida, is a real story, and the light storm becomes a big storm, that you still know about it, speed fast enough to be able to act on it. Accuracy means that the information that you're getting is accurate, right? Is true. And so you can think about, we'll get into this. What are some of the intelligence challenges? Well, there are nefarious actors on the internet there was a sort of a classic case of an explosion in Louisiana that was kicked off by a non-state actor. Multiple bots and trolls forwarded it, so it appeared to be like a big real thing. It was all fake. Relevance means that it has to affect you. So we're going to get to this. OnSolve produces about 20,000 alerts every day. If we sent all of them to you, you would say, if Risk Connect provides those, you would say, look, I'm spending my time just trying to figure out what's important to me. So relevance is does it impact you? And you can think there about, typically in our space, relevance is a function of proximity. Is it nearby? Is it close enough? So you want to, as you think about your risk solutions, you want to do a lot of work in thinking like, can I really control for proximity at a very granular level? If you draw a 1 mile radius around all your assets, that's going to be maybe about right for shootings. Maybe, you could adjust it, but entirely inadequate for earthquakes, right? A magnitude 7 earthquake that happens 5 miles away. And so you need to be able to adjust your proximities for the types of risk. So I'll hit the challenges really quickly. This is our job to solve. It's not your job to solve, but it is something to know. And when I say our, I mean the ecosystem of solution providers. The first is that there are informational gaps. So what do I mean by that? So in the United States, we believe in a free press. The media is the fourth estate. But in many countries, you can think Mexico, journalists get targeted and people are incentivized not to say things on the internet. And so it's therefore incumbent on our data operations team and other operations teams like that to go figure out what is the best way to find information if journalists are jailed or imprisoned or killed. One of the answers for that is that that layered approach becomes more and more important to ensure that you have coverage. The other is you want to source in hyperlocal languages. So by that I mean you want to source directly in Spanish because if you wait for it to come out in English, you're gonna miss it. You can see there the varying levels of details. We talked about that in the source methodology, that some sources have a little bit of information, some have more. But if you wait till the full picture, if you wait till a complete picture of exactly the number of people that were killed in an active shooter event, then it's too late, right? So you have to. The goal is sort of understanding when a small thing, when a big thing amongst many small things is going to be a big thing. There's a question about AI that Denise had that I'm going to come back to on that topic. The fog of war is what it means is oftentimes there's just not enough information early on to know, will this be a big thing? And so you're looking, and the ecosystem is looking for those signals that, this small storm is going to become big. This, Chicago has thousands of shootings every year. This shooting is going to be different. And so that's what our operations teams are looking for. So you want to think about the volume and of data and sources. And all of this there's this ratio of you want valuable information, but like we said, we capture 20,000 events all around the world every day. And so you can't spend your time searching through noise. So there is a lot to be done on filtering out irrelevant information. And we help our clients a lot with that. All that leads into correlation and prioritization. So which of those events are nearest your assets? Which ones do you prioritize? And then the timely delivery to the right audience is some of you are single threaded, meaning it's just you. Mm-hmm. You're at dinner with your wife or your partner or spouse, and you get the text and you're like, who do I push this to? Or you get the email, right? Other times you have a larger team and people can, you have a 3x8 operations center or GSOC or JSOC or whatever. And so you want to think about your processes from the most appropriate way for you to receive that information and then get that to the people who can respond. That was a lot, Brian. I'll go to you, sir.
No, that's really good. And I appreciate that. And I think that's ultimately, I think that top line is key here, is that really come up with a way that is relevant, important to you and what you're trying to solve for. And I think regardless, though, you can judge the process that you've defined through speed, coverage, accuracy, and relevance. And that is huge. So Chris, let's transition a little bit to the value proposition. You want to walk us through this?
Yeah, and so don't advance the slide quite yet. This looks perfect here. I'm going to use an Army phrase. Let's orientate you to the map here. If you look on the y-axis, that's business impact, and so if you go up on the impact, it's worse at the top than it is at the bottom. So you see revenue gets, loss of revenue gets worse. Employee safety gets worse. On the x-axis, you got time there. So I want you to think about a threat to this company. This is company A. Hypothetically, right? And so there's a fire that starts and then that grows. So the fire gets worse, or God forbid, there's an active shooter and the more people. And at some point, the problem is discovered. By the way, this framework works for relationships, marriages. At some point, the problem is discovered, and then from there, presumably, a response starts to happen. And in this scenario, what you see here is you're manually calling people. Hey, Bob, down at the plant, I just heard about a fire. I saw smoke on the horizon, whatever it is. Somebody called me. So this is a very manual process. And if you want to drop in the chat, how could we help this company? And I'll just to complete the curve. So it goes worse and worse. You find out about it. It still gets worse while you're responding. Eventually, you respond to it, and then the problem is resolved. And so, yeah, that's right. So you could shift. Let's go forward one. You could shift your discovery from point A to point B. And what you see there, this is risk intelligence. This is the light blue. This is the effective visibility systems, which is a way visibility, meaning I have visibility. The disruptions are visible to me. So getting that information earlier very frequently means that you can begin responding faster and thereby limit the harm. Let's go back to the name of the hurricane I was talking about earlier in the Philippines was called Hurricane Rai or Typhoon Odette. Most Americans have never even heard of this, but it was brutal. It was hundreds of millions of dollars of damage in Cebu. It ultimately became something that Western media covered as something like 10,000 people were evacuated, and ultimately there were shortages of food and water. So it was a really tragic event. Our clients who knew that, who received the early alerts that this could intensify, were able to shift their resources into India to change their call center patterns, to tell their key clients, and thereby reducing the harm and making the recovery much, much, much faster. So this whole discussion is about the risk. It's also about helping you as practitioners talk to your executive team about that value. And I think this framework is a really good way to do that. So we're going to transition to a couple slides. And so far what we've been talking about is the breaking event, or the rapid expected intensification of the hurricane, the single incident or single group of incidents, the tornado that caused the gas main break, that caused the evacuations, that caused the school closures, right? So we're going to spend just a couple minutes on talking about historical incidents. And I just, before I do that, let me just acknowledge, Kenneth, you've asked a great question about the cadence of updates. We're going to address that at the end as a question. Tammy, you've asked some questions, or you've made a comment here about software that is alerting people involved, and I think that's exactly right. So figure out who's involved and who needs to get those alerts is a key part of this. So thank you for the questions. Keep dropping them, guys, into the chat. We love it. Let's pivot to just a couple minutes on historical data. So what you're seeing there on the map is something like 20,000 alerts in any given day across 50 categories of risk. And if you advance a couple screenshots here, let's go forward. What you're seeing there is some examples there so it's forward-looking strikes and protests on the right, and then on the left, you see some National Weather Service warnings. And so all of these are helpful for this incident. But let's think about what could be done with all this data historically. So let's go forward, Brian. There is significant value in doing pattern analysis as part of your risk intelligence program. So, and you could think of this as like, you could do it at the country level, but what you find is that neighborhoods and micro geographies really are more important. And so the questions that you could answer with this are like, hey, I'm a high-end technology company. I make driverless cars and I put them in different cities. And do I need a fence at this location, or do I need a wall? Or I'm a retail organization and I've seen a rise in arson. Do I need more security or less security at these stores? I'm a business continuity leader or security leader, and I'm working closely with my facilities team. We all fall under enterprise operations, and they're asking me, what do I know about this new site? I'm a business continuity or security leader, and the supply chain resilience team is asking me, hey, post-COVID, I don't think we want to single thread everything through China anymore. We saw what happened. We saw what happens when we push everything through one facility, one port. I need more diversification in my supply chain, and I need to know kind of the patterns of risk. This is about risk insights. Let's go forward one slide. So we'll, just to make this kind of a little bit more tangible, imagine you are on the risk team at a large manufacturer of electric vehicles. The facility team has chosen a site and is asking you, what do we need to know about this site? And so this is a way to think about using historical data to really inform that decision. Let's go to the next slide. One way to do this is to just start at the sort of Austin level, and you can type in an address and get awesome. If we go forward, I think it's 4 clicks, Brian. You can see the top risk, and what you're seeing there is that fire is the #1 risk, but most of those are not. They're not rated. What is an unrated event in our definition of risk intelligence? Well, an unrated event is where the fire department is responding, but there's not enough information to know that it's a 5-alarm fire or whatever. It's just like, hey, it's a fire call. Same thing for power outages. There's a lot of power outages, but most are low. Same thing for shooting. Actually, we're starting to see, obviously, that the severity is increasing. So you can think about this at a city level. What we recommend, let's go to the next slide, Brian, is actually taking these same labels and looking at the particular site. And so what you see here is that looking at the timeline, you see this spike in winter and spring. And so this is actually a real case study. When I was doing this, I thought, Texas freeze. If you drop in the chat, does anyone remember the big year for the Texas freeze? The big year was 2021, but also this year we saw the Texas freeze. And so if we click forward a couple times, what you see there is that there was actually a declaration of emergency from Winter Storm Landon that happened in 2023 this year. I think this historical data is really powerful to give the themes and the big trends that we saw in the last slide, but also the individual narratives that, there are so many events that happen around the world. Your business continuity and security team may be thinking about all of those events, but the facilities team needs to know that there are significant power outages even in the last few months. That may help for planning at the facility level. In real life, when we did this, what we saw is that there were multiple fires around, but there was actually even a fire literally at the site, adjacent to the site, that caused evacuations. So why would a facility team need to know that? Well, maybe that's going to guide how they lay out the site. Maybe there needs to be additional setbacks from the significant brush. Maybe there needs to be additional monitoring, maybe exercises. So this data, this pattern analysis, can really help bolster your business continuity and security program. And all of that is about making better risk-based decisions. So the first, I would say 70% of our conversation today is about how do you react to a braking incident. In this last 10 minutes is about how do you make better decisions at a little bit more of a macro level. And you can see the types of questions. Should we purchase more surveillance cameras? Should we update our severe weather response plans? What kind of insurance for our new building? All of this helps with powering a threat and vulnerability matrix, improving your real estate planning, bolstering your expat, driver safety, traveler safety. Traveler is something we've sort of just barely touched on today, but it's a big part of your program. And then obviously supporting your supply chain team. So a lot there on pattern analysis and using historical data. I'm going to turn to you, Brian, just a second. I just want to say Tammy has a question here. She says, or a comment, another way to look at an IT issue is how many times the same area fails and needs recovery. That is absolutely exactly in line with this. It's predicting the future is difficult, but if you know the patterns of the past, it can really help you. Great comment, Tammy.
That's good. Thank you, Chris. So one of the things we thought we would cover here is how do you get started, and taking a look at all the experiences that many different organizations have had, both good and bad. What can we learn from that, or what can we learn, regarding the positives? And, when I talked before about, getting started, and I mentioned that digital model of the organization, it's great to be able to get information, but to meet that relevance requirement that Chris talked about, having that digital model of the organization is absolutely essential so that you can have that correlation. And so again, there's lots of debate out there. Do you do a business impact analysis or not? Well, let's just put that aside for a moment. Put the term, the acronym aside. Going through the effort to be able to understand how you go to market, how do you deliver your products and services, what are the activities that you're using, what are all of the resources, where are they located? That's the digital model of the organization. And that's usually a key output of a BIA or some other kind of get to know yourself type effort. And to me, that's foundational because that establishes relevance. It's something that we can connect the myriad of threat and risk intelligence to. Now, it's also, I think, important to be able to go ahead and establish a desired scope. And what I mean by that is, what are the different threats and risks that really you want to be able to monitor? Because not everything can be monitored all the time at equal speeds and equal levels. And so you also probably need to get started somewhere. So you might look at this and say, you know what, I want to focus on natural disasters and cyber attack. And then that way we can get into also another form of scope, which is, do I want to inform proactive decision making and strategy setting, or do I want to be able to do reactive? Doesn't mean you have to choose, but again, recognizing that, as Chris used in his case studies, the proactive is a very, very powerful message as both a time and cost savings measure for executives, because it's a lot easier to build in resilience and think about these things in advance rather than react or bolt on later on. So once you've identified kind of who you are and you've set a scope as to what are the things that you're most worried about and how do you want to use this information, it's all about figuring out what are your sources. What are your sources and or service providers? And again, there's a lot of information out there, but it all comes down to picking and choosing the best. And it's more often than not, it's more than one source and possibly even more than one service provider, free or subscribed. And so how do you go through that process of being able to connect the dots and make sure you have that inbound that's correlated? Now that correlation is really number 4. And that I called it the early warning system here. And that's really, think of it as the old switchboard when it came to delivering phone calls in the past. I got this inbound. Well, where am I plugging this into and who's going to get that information? And how do we automate that? So again, to Chris's point, you're out at dinner. It just happens automatically, and you're not the bottleneck or the single point of failure. And so it's all really about being able to go ahead and make sure you've got advance notice, but so do all the right people that potentially own or have responsibility for responding to that specific risk. And Chris mentioned it before, exercises are becoming even more and more important, much more frequent, because that's where you develop confidence. But as part of exercising, make sure you're able to go ahead and simulate and use threat intelligence as a triggering mechanism, and including some of your critical communications as well. Chris, any reactions to those? Anything you might want to add?
Just, we talked about pattern analysis for decision making before. I think it can also really be helpful in exercises. And so what I mean by that, if you're in an area where maybe you've been spared by whatever, the storm strike protest disaster, but if you look and see, like, actually, this is the big risk, this is what we should be thinking about, that can be really helpful. You can also, there are many solutions, ours included, that you can even do historical research on, like, let's say you're a retail brand and you take 5 or 10 of your largest competitors and say, well, what have they been hit with? So a lot of this is about learning vicariously. But I do just want to hit the exercise component is just so important. Literally getting in a room and saying, what if this happens, workshopping it, who's going to need to know. You're going to identify, like, Bill's new up in whatever finance or whatever, and we've never brought them into the crisis management team. And so the exercise piece is really, really important.
Absolutely. All right, so we wanted to save a little bit of time just to make sure we had addressed any questions you might have. So if you haven't done so already and you want to put anything in the chat, please do so. But Chris, I think you're going to kick us off here a little bit in terms of some of our conclusions.
Yeah, so I'll start with risk and threats. And I think if it's not clear, we wanted to end on some clarity on this. There is broad industry consensus on what risk intelligence means, and that's what we've been talking about today. But I want you to think about, or you should at least be aware that some people use the terms differently. Some people would say an incident is a thing that's happened. An event is a thing we're planning for. A risk is a thing that could happen. There's some probability associated with risk versus some people use the term, usually our company uses, when we say threats, we think about a threat to an individual. So meeting soon with a political party, and there, you think about threats to individuals versus generalized risk to a site. I think, Brian, let me turn to you for the second and third bullet, sir.
Yeah, the second bullet, I think, this is going to sound funny, but the most important word that I hope everyone takes away is the word and. And that is the fact that hopefully you've heard us say it a couple different times today, that when we talk about risk intelligence, it's an and proposition. We're trying to prevent risks from occurring and affecting our organizations and our stakeholders. But at the same time, we know we can't prevent everything. So it has to be an and trigger the best response, the most timely response to be able to go ahead and minimize impact. And so I think that is an absolute key. And again, I think when I've worked with people to justify time and resource spend when it comes to threat and risk intelligence, it is heavily based, the most successful are the ones that are able to go ahead and focus on the proactive and the reactive, not just the reactive. So I think that's important. And again, I know I've said it twice, that whole concept of self-awareness, whatever tool and process you use to be able to bring kind of that digital model of your organization together that can establish relevance with all of these risk intelligence sources, that's huge as well. Chris?
Yeah, I'll hit the importance about configuration. It's probably been clear, but if not, there is a world of risk out there. We think they're on the rise. We think the volume intensity seem to be on the way up. But every organization is staffed differently. We have something like 125 people on this call. My guess is that maybe 50%, and without looking at the numbers, wear multiple hats. So business continuity and some other hat. Maybe 30% are single threaded. Maybe 10% have 2 to 3 people, and maybe, I'm doing my math right, another 10% may have more than 3 people in a risk management function. And what this means is that the way that you look to your providers to collect information, to filter it out, the way that you set your proximities, the type of information you receive, the who receives it, the level of automation really needs to be configurable and focused to an organization that looks like yours. So, I mean, just one example here. If you look to service providers with public data, so service providers, I mean like a team of analysts and public data sources, so meaning like National Weather Services, watches and warnings, that might be appropriate for a small team. Then as you grow, you may want to start turning on additional sources. And so, our operations team spends a lot of time making the solution available for the small team, for the, hey, I'm just getting started here, all the way up to the, hey, I've got 20 people in my risk program, and all of them have different needs. Brian, we actually have 2 good questions here.
All right.
I'll take a stab at them, and then I'll turn it to you, sir. So,
sounds good.
Denise, very early on, you said, how are you leveraging artificial intelligence to get proactive or predictive versus reactive to the news and weather? And your question is excellent. You are sort of implying in your question, Denise, that the news can be sort of a retrospective, the thing that, so this morning, this awful thing that happened, right? And so how can you use AI to get there? I'm going to talk about what our operations and R&D team, how we think about that question. I think it's generally consistent for the industry. And if it's not, then it's probably where our industry should head. So for, let's say since probably 2013 to 2015, the rise of machine learning started getting better and better at taking a piece of text or a picture and saying, this is a tornado, not a soccer team named Tornadoes. This is a shooting, not a movie being shot. and it's happening at this location. For a long time, the AI would only do at a city level. Now, if the street is named, it can get down to street level. And so I'll give you some specific examples on this. In the Maui fires, we had probably 30 alerts leading up to the evacuation of Lahaina. And so that was artificial intelligence saying that, and it's classic dynamic risk story. August 8th, the fires happened. July 30th, the big risk was coastal flooding. So the emergency management team thinking about coastal flooding, coastal floods resolved. August 4th, the AI picked up that the airport was likely to close because of a fire in Maui. August 4th, 4 days prior. The AI then picked up that the airport was reopening as the fire was mostly contained. The AI then started picking up that there were high wind warnings. Those turned into gale warnings. The AI picked up that there were power outages. So now think about this. You've got, small fires with containment, high wind, then gale winds, then power outages, power poles being knocked down, and then you start seeing road closures ultimately leading to evacuations. So today, in general, the best artificial intelligence is taking, millions and millions and millions of data, pieces of data, taking all that and then parsing that down to what is most important for these particular events. And then where's the industry headed? The industry headed is in saying, look, this is a place where we're seeing drought conditions, high wind turning to gales, reports of power outages. We know what this looks like. Right? And so being able to do pattern matching at broader and broader data points. Hopefully that made sense. Drop something in the chat if it didn't. Brian, anything to comment there? And then I'm going to go to Kenneth's question.
Yeah, I'd just add one real quick thing, Chris. And it was a great question, great answer. I think the other part here is also through the use of AI, and this, I'm not talking fantasy land here. This is like, we're on the cusp of this right now, is not only consuming what has happened, getting predictions on what may happen, but also being able to get input based on the way in which you're structured and who are all of your key dependencies. What are the strategies and actions you should consider taking, whether it's pre-planned as part of a, literally a business continuity or crisis management plan, or something that's more dynamic. And I think AI is really going to be something that is very, very helpful, again, with that pattern recognition, but also to be able to go more of an ad hoc strategy response communication effort as just another source of input and opinion.
It's great comment. We've actually spoken on the rise of large language models, the most popular being ChatGPT, and what that's going to do to our industry. There's so many exciting. There's a lot to be concerned about, particularly if I put on my American citizen hat. There's a lot to be concerned about. Just in general on the large language models piece, I'll say that it's a superpower for the good guys and it's a superpower for the bad guys. Mm-hmm. So that's let me go to Kenneth's question here. I know we're almost out of time. Kenneth, you say, a challenge may be in determining the cadence of the updates. And by that, I think you're saying new information once an event is identified. I think that's exactly right. So I want you to think about, throughout this call, we've talked about a continuous process of change. By that, I mean, the storm is moving and the storm grows and then it becomes a big thing. And that is true for almost all kinds of risks. The fire moves, the fire is now contained, the fire is not contained. The shooter is no, he's not identified. That's a different shooter, right? So if you were to graph all these out over the x-axis, we tend to think of incidents as like a thing, but it's actually lots of things that change. And so our R&D team spends a lot of time thinking about real-time updates, right? So if you were to take a picture of a thing, like if an analyst were to write and send you a report, that may still be the best information available, but the thing may have changed. And so one of the advantages of AI is the ability to continually update in real time. As more information is made available, the SITREP, the situational report, is updated in real time. So it's a great question, Kenneth. I will turn it to you, Brian. We are at the top of the hour.
Yeah, I think we're out of time. I'm going to put up our contact information. If anybody has any follow-up questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out to Chris or I and be happy to help in any way. But Chris, thanks so much for joining me today. Thanks to our, the audience for your engagement, your questions, and your comments. Really do appreciate it. And again, if there's any other information you'd like on the topic of threat and risk intelligence, by all means, please reach out. In the meantime,
Brian, I got to just do this real quick. We've got an infiltrator. Mao is coming in saying that it's they just say go Navy.
No.
Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. Go Navy. But
so we got all three covered here.
Mao, go Army, beat them. Thanks, guys.
All right, take care, everybody. Bye-bye.